Hello, this is Dr. Jeff, and I am attending California Council for the Social Studies Conference this weekend, actually, and presenting there. Topic is Ethnography, supporting our students to know and tell their stories. I'll be presenting as well as my colleague, Dr. Grace Cho. A little bit about myself. First of all, National Board Certified Teacher. This is my 20th year in Anaheim Union High School District. I serve in a number of roles, including History Department Chair, 5Cs Instructional Coach, Civic Learning Coach for the district, Induction Support Provider, and Adjunct Faculty at Cal State Fullerton. Also have a YouTube called Ed Family, where I have a lot of these topics on ethnic studies, Korean American studies, but also civic learning engagement, classroom management, project-based learning, and more. This is my colleague, Dr. Grace Cho, and she's faculty at Cal State Fullerton, had been department chair, and very recently had earned a very prestigious 2021 President's Commendation Award. I'll be presenting with her. Now, some of us may have already seen this in the news that California has become the first state to require ethnic studies for high school graduation. So what will this look like in our schools? Well, I think it's a great opportunity for our schools to help students to get to know and tell their stories. So this is kind of like an agenda that I might typically have in my class, like with a driving question, the DQ, like how do I support students to know and tell their stories? So that's a question we're asking for this workshop. And then a we can statement. We can consider ideas on how we might incorporate PBLs, the 5Cs to elevate student voice, choice, purpose, passion, agency, and action through the telling of their own story. We're going to begin with a little why, talk about a couple of strategies like the My Story and Photo Voice, continue on to talk about My Story of Resilience, and then go ahead and close this time with some resources and an exit slip. First of all, I think this is worthwhile to think about, and you might want to pause the video after I read each of these questions. Why is it important for students to know their story? Why is it important for students to tell their story? Why is it important for others to listen to their story with empathy and respect? And why is it important to do something good with your story? Now, in our district, we're encouraged to know our students by name, needs, assets, and their stories and passions. But what if we're, as teachers, wanting to truly know this from our students, but the students themselves don't know their own story? Now, for myself, I can kind of relate to this. Growing up, I never had a teacher that looked like me, and I really didn't know my own story. The immigrant life is one where there's a lot of challenges, and sometimes there could be a language barrier, or sometimes life has a lot of things going on. So sometimes that space is not there to hear the story, or maybe I'm not in that place to hear that story either. But then as you get older, you're asking that question, who am I? I'm so thankful that I've gotten to know my parents' story, though, and it's giving me great resilience. Folks that have survived the Korean War, been a part of the Miracle on the Han, through the competitive process, was able to attend some of the most prestigious universities in Korea, and then post 1965, after the exclusion acts were repealed, having the opportunity to come to the United States for greater opportunity and making a difference in the United States. And this is a part of their story of resilience, but when I know it, it also becomes a part of my story of resilience as well. Now, really quickly, where are you at right now with helping your students know and tell their story? Sometimes they call this an ethnography. Would you say you're like very uncomfortable, not sure what you how to try? 2, you want to try, but do you feel a little bit uncomfortable? 3, you've had some success with getting to know your students and have them tell their story. You've had some good successes, right, with 4. Or, hey, let's present next time if you're a 5, right? You have some great strategies and you'd want to team up with me and want to know that as well. So there's already a lot of things that you're probably doing to get to know your students, and I want to encourage you to continue to do that. What it is that you are doing, and to validate yourself that this is worthwhile and helpful for building community. And I'll just take a couple of questions as well, like or thoughts. What is it that you hope to get out of today in this workshop? When you came to this workshop, what was it that you're hoping to get out of today? Now, I will tell you this, as we build fostering an environment where students are able to know and tell their story, once again, there's probably a lot already happening in your class for this to happen. Could be you're beginning with that community building or having students tell their story. Maybe you're incorporating that civic engagement and learning, and you're doing that community building in class where you're designing the kind of classroom that students want to learn in with the social contract. You're having civic friendships. You talked about civic friendships and creating norms, and you allow students to work in teams, and there's project-based learning and their affirmation. So this isn't separate from students knowing and telling their story. It's creating actually a fertile ground for students to know and tell their story. And then, of course, for others to listen with empathy and respect. And then, of course, perhaps something that they can actually do something with their story as well. Ideally, maybe some type of civic action, some type of compassion for others. So let's go ahead and begin with that first piece. Once again, I think it really begins with knowing students, but sometimes for students it's tough to share this. So making it easy for them, right? So one thing I like to do is something called the My Story assignment. Once again, as I teach history, I'd like to say that history is made up of a lot of stories, his and her stories, and I want to begin with your story to create our story. And so on their Google slide, we might create a Google slide. Each student creates a Google slide, creating a class slide deck. They're just writing different things. Like it could be, things like their family, their name, birthplace, future college, things like that. But it could also be questions that relate to what makes you happy, or what makes you laugh, what makes you feel brave, what makes you feel thankful. And of course, giving the students a chance to share with one another, share in groups. Once again, letting them know that we value students. And once again, this is that beginning step into knowing students by name, need, assets, stories, and passions. Here's a sample of one, actually. The next activity I might do is something called a photo voice, and telling our story through photos, photographic storytelling. And this is so great for all kinds of learners, especially plurilingual students, where visuals can provide a scaffold and support, or students with special needs. But once again, when we pave the way for our students with greatest needs, it also paves the way for all our learners. And so I might give an example of one that I did myself, and this might be something that they do in class as well, where we do a showed analysis. And in that, they could be looking at one another's photos and kind of just trying to guess, what is it that I see, what I think is happening, how this relates to my life, because this is happening, because this can educate others by, what we can do about this is. Or it could be more of the person actually analyzes that photo. So what I see is a picture of my mother and two of my daughters in front of the Bell of Friendship in San Pedro, California. Actually, I came here after I learned about the Bell of Friendship. It was my first time this year I learned about it, but it was basically a gift given by the Republic of Korea to the United States in 1976 as a gesture of friendship. And it kind of reminded me of my Korean American journey. And I came to this place and actually thank my mother for her story of resilience. So I think there's a place for these kinds of stories, because it allows for us to be vulnerable with our students and to let them know that this is something that we're doing as well, not just asking or imposing upon them, but a discovery process that we're going through ourselves. And when we model that, that oftentimes gives permission and opens the doors for our students as well. Now, my colleague, Dr. Grace Cho, she's also teaching some classes over at Cal State Fullerton, including teaching English learners. And she has this photo voice assignment actually as an assignment for her college students, those who want to become teachers. And so here are some of her directions that they're creating, very similar to the directions that my students would receive. And once again, this is creating that student sample, right? If you wanted to do it in your class, I always think it's good for the teacher to have a student sample before they actually present And some things and topics have included current events, environment and humanitarian efforts, education, family and community. And I would say this parallels what I've seen in the classroom as well. So what the teachers, the pre-service teachers were creating, also were topics that I saw amongst my students as well in middle and high school. So here are some different examples: migrant workers in the United States, community service, hobbies, interests, and arts, homelessness in California, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and environmental studies topic, supporting local communities. All right. And now let's get into continuing the journey, right? Helping our students know and tell their story. I had this one ethnography assignment, one that was a little bit more expansive, called The Story of Resilience with my 10th graders, actually at Cambridge Virtual Academy. And so it might begin with what I just shared, the My Story assignment, and maybe adding in what does your name mean, a family tree, but then adding some additional questions like what would you say are some similarities and differences between your generation and your parents' generation? And the photo voice is also there as well. And oral history with at least one family member. Or share your history of your people from your ethnic ancestry. Story of how your family has made America a better place. And once again, these are stories that oftentimes many of my students have not thought about, have not asked their parents. Once again, maybe it's very busy, a lot of challenges, so never had the opportunity to ask these questions. But when students are interested in their parents, I find that parents are more than willing to share a piece of that story with them when they're showing that kind of interest and desire. Definition of what cultural pluralism is, defining how their home culture adds to America, seeing being bicultural or multicultural as a strength of their future, and then thinking themselves how they plan to contribute to make America a better place. So once again, knowing your story, telling your story, listening to others because others will have a chance to present, and then doing something good with it. And then how does it define your cultural identity? How does your individual identity shape you? Now, once again, ethnicity does not encompass all of your identity. Our identity is more than just our ethnicity, but it is nonetheless a significant part of our story. And I think it's worthwhile to discover other aspects of our identity as well. But anyways, we did something in 10th grade. So once again, I just showed you a little outline of what the history department did, but they did that in partnership with English language arts, because there's clearly a lot of writing and speaking and listening that's happening. That's all a part of the ELA standards as well. But fortunately, as I kind of let the team know, hey, this is something we're going to do, science also participated, math also participated, and they incorporated the aspect of telling the story of ethnic foods using chemistry and math, and looking at how many calories, and energy that would be produced, and the math behind that. So once again, an interesting component that was added to this work. And once again, when you're having this cross-curricular opportunity, it just deepens the learning and the understanding, right? And then of course, even PE, their journey of resilience. So they had this journey that they had to take a certain number of steps that needed to be completed, and they would journal about their process, journal about their thinking as well. I even brought up the idea of maybe a walk and talk where they're talking with their family members about their journey as well. So this is a way to bring in that cross-curricular collaboration. And actually at the school that I teach at Cambridge Virtual Academy, we try to encourage that, to have as much cross-curricular as possible, so that the students, when they're just, rather than having 6 other teachers, you have many teachers working on one module together, and that's been helpful for many of our students. Anyways, this is an assignment from one of my 7th grade students, and I was just taking a look at his middle name, right, Hidemi, and that was actually his grandma's brother, who passed away when he was 3. He had died of cancer, and it was during the time when his grandmother and family were in Japanese internment camps. And just a reminder that children were in internment camps, and children who had cancer were in internment camps. And his middle name, as he looked into his middle name, he learned who this person was. And once again, You can see here that I carry the name as it shows the struggles my family has gone through and represents the perseverance and strength. And I think when you don't know your story, I think there's a potential to kind of be ashamed. Like if someone asks you, yeah, tell me what it means to be Korean or Korean American, and if you didn't have something to say, you haven't processed this. Sometimes, I'm not saying always, but you could feel a little bit ashamed of not knowing, right? So that's why I think it's so important to know your story and to be able to tell your story well. I think this might be the first time this student knew or thought about their parents experiencing racism as a child. So when interviewing their parents, when my parents first moved to America, they didn't speak English, which was a major obstacle. My dad told me how he faced racism as a child. And you know what? Who would want to talk about the racism that they experienced when they were a child to your own children nonetheless, right? But I think this is very, very rarely done in many households. And but I bet, though, when there's the opportunity to hear these stories, wow, my parents were so resilient. My parents still overcame. I think it can give them a sense of strength too. And if they experienced or had experienced something like this, they don't feel alone. Their parents had experienced this as well. One of my students chose this image for their photo voice of children cramped together in these large rooms, and this was a topic that they cared about. Once again, do I tell the students, hey, these are the topics that you must choose? No, the students choose topics that they are passionate about. And of course, from here, they could also give speeches too, if that's what they wanted to do. I had a student here who actually could trace his family all the way back to Plymouth and the Mayflower story. But I think even this is an important story to tell, and especially an important story to tell because I think it's a reminder that, you know, whoever we are, unless we're Native American, we have our migration story. And that's an important story to remember, and that's an important concept to know as we learn about one another's migration stories, unless you're Native American, right? Let's see. Yeah, asking, having an oral history of your parents. Now, how many of us could say we have oral history documented from our parents? That we have something where we could look at and we could pass on to the next generation. And now, some of you, and this is a social science history group, some of you may have something like that, but. You know, what a wonderful legacy to have to the next generation. And then I tell the students, like, what happens if this story is not told? Let's say, you know, years go by, this story is not told. What happens to this story? It disappears from history. You won't get this story back because it was in that person, right? And oftentimes the history of certain folks are not talked about in history, right? And so that's why their capturing of oral history becomes so important. They are kind of like not just history scholars, but history makers, wouldn't you say? So you can see here that this student created a little montage of what does cultural pluralism mean to me. And here's some great quotes. Rather than abandoning the aspects of myself that make me unique, I've learned to maintain and appreciate them. I realize that in a pluralistic society, you don't need to hide your identity because you can learn so much about others through their stories while sharing your own story because it makes you unique. Living in a place where hundreds of different identities and cultural backgrounds exist, I've learned to embrace my own identity. I realize I don't need to suppress who I am just because I'm not the same as others, because everyone is unique and our differences can coexist in the same community. Here's another person who talked about cultural pluralism. It means, for example, I used to get bullied for food I brought to school. I used to bring miakuk, which is a seaweed soup, and get made fun of it. But I didn't understand why, because it was so good, and used to cry and complain to my mom why I couldn't just have a sandwich or something like others. It may seem small, and I was just a little kid, but I was ashamed of something that was from my origin, and I learned not to be ashamed of your culture. Here's another one. One of the things my home culture brings into America is K-pop. Not exactly a value, but it brought respect and got noticed for this. I remember when I was younger, this girl asked where I was from, and I answered South Korea. She laughed and said, "So you don't come from nowhere?" And she didn't know where it was. But 6 years later, she became a fan of K-pop and claimed she loved Korea. How is being bicultural a strength? And here's an example of a Pakistani American who shared about how being bicultural is a strength. Here's an example from a Mexican American. And then their plan to make America a better place, to contribute, to make it a better home for others, to participate in nonprofit organizations, and giving the students a chance to think about this. I think in students is a passion, is a desire to do something, but we have to give them that space to kind of think and reflect about it. And then now how students see themselves, and giving them once again that opportunity to reflect. I see myself as a proud Latin American girl who followed her dreams and became a doctor. Furthermore, I am someone who contributed to this world to help others. I value many things in my life. One of them is my core values, such as strong morals and kindness to others. I want to show people that despite what your ethnic background is, you can be anything you want to be, as I aspire to represent all Hispanics and demonstrate to the world that with dedication and positivity, you can accomplish just about anything. I hope that one day I can be a good role model for younger generations, just like my aunt is to me. My culture shaped me into something unique that has a chance to be what I always wished to become in this country, and in doing so, I'm confident that my whole family is now and will continue to be proud of all my academic achievements. So this story of resilience, you can see how powerful it is as they begin to know their story, tell their story, listen to one another's stories, and then do something good with their story. Now, I went through this presentation relatively quickly, but if you're interested, I have all kinds of videos related to ethnic studies. I have an ethnic studies playlist, where to begin with ethnic studies, or how students can use photos to tell their story, or helping students to know and tell their stories, or using the ethnic studies model curriculum to create a virtual museum, all on my EdFamily YouTube page, as well as my Twitter account at EdFamilyTweets. So now that you've had a chance to kind of hear this presentation, we've had a chance to talk about knowing our students and allowing them to tell their stories. We talked about the My Story assignment, the photo voice. We talked about the story of resilience. Now, as you think about your plan, what is your plan as you move forward? At this conference, you've heard many different presentations, and in this one workshop, you've heard plenty as well. And the thing is, if you don't implement it within 72 hours, oftentimes you'll forget some of the lessons learned. So if you were to take a moment and reflect on what is your 72-hour plan to get started with this, one step in the direction that you want to go, what would that be? What would that be? Taking a little moment to think about that. And then here are some I statements for us to kind of reflect on. I realize I'm thinking about how I would like to learn more about. And I want you to also write this down. And maybe even pair share it with the person next to you. And then I'm going to open it up now to questions. Any questions? Questions about your next steps, what your next steps might be. Hashtag ask me a question. And lastly, before we move on to the next workshop, just take a breath. Pause, stop, and reflect. Just appreciating yourself, reflecting on what you've learned, thinking about what you want to hold closely, pondering on your next step, hoping for the best, giving it your best. This is Dr. Jeff from Ed Family. If this video helped you to support your students with ethnographies, to know and tell their stories, go ahead and give it a like. And if you like professional development like this, whether it's on ethnic studies, ethnographies, civic learning, engagement, project-based learning, the 5 C's, go ahead and subscribe. I have a video coming out every week. This is Dr. Jeff signing out.